Welcome back, everyone. Excited to jump into today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to take a look at the UK economy.
Right.
And we've got a ton of sources here. Government reports, economic analyses, data sets, the whole shebang.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty fascinating. We're talking about real-world impacts here, how these economic trends are hitting your wallet, your job, your future.
Exactly. We're going to go deeper than the headlines, figure out the real challenges that the UK is facing, and importantly, look at some potential solutions.
And it's important to remember that economics is rarely black and white. We have to look at different viewpoints because policies, they always have trade-offs, winners and losers in every scenario.
Right. So we have to examine who benefits from the way things are now and who might be affected by changes.
For sure.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The UK economy in 2023. It looks wildly different from 2003.
Yeah.
And the reports we have, they paint a pretty bleak picture. One even uses the phrase significantly worse to describe things now.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about some abstract numbers. This is about real people's lives. For instance, the government report. It shows that real wages, what you can actually buy with your income, it's plummeted by 15-20% since 2003.
15-20%? Wow, that's a massive drop. Can you give us a real-world example of what that means for the average person?
Okay, imagine this. Back in 2003, you go to the supermarket, fill your trolley, pay your bills, still have enough left over for maybe a weekend getaway. Today, that same income might only cover the bare essentials.
Right, your purchasing power has just vanished.
Exactly.
I think everyone listening can relate to that feeling. Your money just doesn't go as far as it used to. The sources we have, they really highlight this with some pretty shocking comparisons of living costs.
Yeah, like house prices. In 2003, you could find a decent place for about 120,000 pounds today. You're looking at least 290,000, maybe even more.
No wonder people are struggling to buy a home. And it's not just housing. Energy bills have gone through the roof too. Remember when you could heat your home for like 600 pounds a year?
Yeah. Those days are long gone. Now you're looking at bills over 1,800 pounds, sometimes even higher.
That's a triple whammy right there.
Ugh.
So we've got shrinking wages, rising costs. What are the factors that have led to this downturn? The sources point to several key issues.
Yeah, one major issue that they highlight is the unfairness of the tax burden. A lot of wealthy individuals and corporations, they're using loopholes like offshore accounts to avoid paying their fair share. Meanwhile, everyday workers are stuck with a much higher tax burden.
And that has a ripple effect, right? Less tax revenue means less money for things like public services.
Exactly. We're seeing the consequences of that now. Strain on the NHS, long wait times, declining quality of care.
And then you've got the train strikes. Workers are dissatisfied with pay and conditions.
It all points to a trend of underinvestment in essential services. And when these services crumble, it weakens the economy further, creates a vicious cycle.
One area that really stood out to me in the research was the skyrocketing cost of transport. The difference between 2003 and 2023 is unbelievable. Yeah, the report actually uses the example of a season ticket from Brighton to London in 2003. It was about 2,000 pounds. Now in 2023, that same ticket is over 5,300 pounds.
More than double. That's a huge chunk of anyone's salary. I can see why people are choosing to work from home or find other ways to get around.
Absolutely. And the sources dig into why this has happened. One factor is the privatization of the railways. It's shifted the focus to profits instead of affordable fares for commuters.
So less government regulation means private companies can basically set whatever prices they want.
Yeah, that's part of it. We also see the impact of reduced government subsidies for public transport, less financial support to keep fares down, and of course fuel prices are rising. That affects all modes of transport.
It makes you think, how has the cost of just getting around affected your life personally? Your budget, where you choose to live, your overall quality of life, these costs have a real impact.
Definitely.
And that brings us to another crucial element highlighted in the research, inflation. One report asks a pretty provocative question. Is inflation a trick to keep the poor poor and the rich rich?
That's a bold statement. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely complex. But the research argues that while inflation might not be some deliberate scheme, its effects often hit lower-income households the hardest.
How so?
Well, think about the rising cost of essentials like food and energy. Everyone needs those things. But lower-income households, they feel the pinch much more. A larger portion of their income goes towards covering those basic costs.
Makes sense. So while prices are rising for everyone, it's hitting those who can least afford it the hardest.
Exactly. And on the other side, the report shows how the wealthy can use inflation to their advantage. Investing in assets that go up in value during inflationary periods, their wealth grows, while others struggle.
It's almost like a seesaw. One side goes up, the other goes down.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And this disparity in how inflation affects different income groups, it's a major concern highlighted in the reports.
I see that.
It really makes you think about how much your weekly grocery shop costs now compared to a few years ago. That's inflation at work. And for many, it's a constant struggle to keep up.
Yeah, I can see that.
And this leads us perfectly to the next part of our deep dive. What solutions are being proposed to address these economic challenges?
Right. Let's get into that.
We'll dive into those proposed reforms in part 2.
Sounds good. So amidst all this kind of doom and gloom, the government report does actually offer some glimmers of hope. They outline a bunch of proposed reforms that really try to tackle these issues head on, especially inequality and wage stagnation.
That's good to hear. What are some of the key proposals?
One big focus is overhauling the tax system. The report specifically targets this thing called the carried interest loophole. It's something that benefits private equity and fund managers.
I've heard that term before, but I'll admit I don't fully grasp it. Can you explain it a bit more?
Sure, carried interest. It's basically the share of profits that these fund managers get. Currently, it's taxed at a lower rate than regular income, which a lot of people see as unfair. So the proposal aims to close this loophole, raise the tax rate on carried interest, bring it in line with income tax rates.
So leveling the playing field.
Exactly. The report also suggests a two-pronged approach to putting more money in the pockets of low-income workers, boost the national living wage, and adjust income tax thresholds.
What would those adjustments look like?
Well, one idea is to completely eliminate income tax for anyone earning below a certain threshold. It's a bold move, but it could be a huge help for millions of people.
That would be a game changer for so many families struggling to make ends meet. Are there any other reforms that address tax avoidance? Like those offshore accounts we talked about.
Definitely. The report directly tackles those offshore trusts and domicile status issues. They're serious about cracking down on the strategies used by the wealthy to avoid paying their fair share.
It sounds like a pretty comprehensive plan. Are there any concerns about potential downsides to these reforms?
Of course. Every policy has its critics. Some experts worry that these tax hikes could discourage investment, could even lead to capital flight. Basically, wealthy individuals and businesses might move their assets out of the country to avoid the higher taxes.
That's a valid concern. So it's like walking a tightrope, trying to create a fairer system without scaring away investment.
Exactly. It highlights how complex economic reforms can be. Always potential downsides, unintended consequences that need to be carefully considered. But the report also predicts that these reforms could bring in a ton of revenue for the government, potentially billions of pounds every year.
That brings us to another interesting point from the source material. It looks into the UK's spending habits, especially when it comes to foreign aid and military expenditures.
Yeah, the reports highlight the huge amounts of money the UK has given to places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine over the years. For instance, aid to Afghanistan since 2001 is estimated to be between 30 and 40 billion pounds.
Those are massive sums, especially given the economic struggles at home. It makes you wonder if maybe it's time to rethink those spending priorities.
Right. And that's what the sources encourage us to do. Think critically. Could shifting even a small portion of those funds towards domestic issues, like better public services or higher wages, could that have a more direct positive impact on people's lives? It's definitely worth considering.
For sure. It raises a lot of questions. How do we balance helping others around the world with the needs of our own citizens? What are the trade-offs?
These are tough decisions. No easy answers. But by looking at different viewpoints and understanding the potential consequences, we can at least start to form more informed opinions and have constructive debates about the UK economy.
Speaking of winners and losers, the research digs into who has actually been doing well in the UK economy since 2008, despite the overall picture of stagnation.
It's pretty eye-opening. The sources highlight specific sectors and corporations that have managed to thrive amidst all the economic turmoil.
So who are the winners?
One clear example is the rise of private companies delivering public services. Companies like Serco and Capita, they've secured big contracts in healthcare prisons, even welfare assessments.
So while public services are struggling, private companies in those same areas are making profits.
Right. It raises some questions about the balance between public and private interests. And then there's the financial sector, banks, private equity firms. They've benefited from those corporate tax cuts and the carried interest loopholes we talked about.
And we can't forget about the energy and utility giants, BP and Shell, for example. They're posting record profits, while consumers are dealing with sky-high energy bills.
Yeah, it's a pattern across several sectors. The defense industry keeps getting lucrative contracts, and even tech giants like Amazon and Google, despite their global reach, they've managed to minimize their UK tax burdens.
It feels like a system where certain players are winning, no matter what's happening to everyday people. Almost like the game is rigged in their favor.
And that brings us back to our discussion of tax cuts, offshore wealth, and the power of corporate lobbying. These factors have a huge impact on the economy. And who benefits from it?
It's a wake-up call. But by understanding how the system works, we can start pushing for change. Demand policies that create a fairer and more sustainable economy for everyone.
And that's where the potential of these proposed reforms comes in. It's a chance to rebalance things, close loopholes, ensure that the burden of economic hardship is shared more fairly.
It won't be easy. But by having these conversations and demanding accountability from our leaders, we can strive for a better economic future for the UK.
It's important to understand these reforms aren't just about raising taxes, it's about creating a system that's fairer and more sustainable. And if they manage to bring in the projected revenue, it could open up opportunities to reinvest in public services, strengthen the safety net for those who need it most.
That leads us to the heart of the matter. What does all this mean for the average person in the UK? How will these reforms, these challenges, these economic shifts affect their daily lives?
Right. Well, let's connect the dots. We've talked about the decline in real wages, the rising cost of living, the strain on public services, and the unequal distribution of wealth. These are all connected issues that directly affect people's quality of life.
Think about it. If your wages haven't kept up with inflation, you're essentially earning less than you did years ago. That means less money for the things you need and enjoy.
And when you add in the rising costs of housing, energy, and transport, it becomes even harder to make ends meet. Families have to make tough choices about what to prioritize, what to cut back on, how to stretch their budget further.
It's a constant juggling act. And for many, it's a source of stress and anxiety. The reports show that millions in the UK are struggling to afford basic necessities, relying on food banks, facing the very real possibility of poverty.
And that's why strengthening public services is so important. A strong social safety net, a well-funded NHS, affordable housing, accessible education. These things can make a huge difference in people's lives, especially during tough economic times.
But as we've seen, those public services are under immense pressure due to years of austerity measures. It's a bit of a catch-22. The economy struggles, leading to cuts in public spending, which then weakens the very institutions that could help people cope with the downturn.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle, and it's something the proposed reforms are trying to break. By generating more revenue through fairer taxation, the government could reinvest in these essential services, create a more resilient and equitable society.
It's not just about government action, though. The sources also talk about the role of individuals and communities in navigating these economic challenges.
One thing that comes up a lot is the importance of financial literacy, making smart choices about spending, saving, and investing.
Right. Even in tough times, there are things we can do to manage our money better, protect ourselves from the worst effects of the downturn.
The sources also emphasize the power of collective action and community support. People coming together, sharing resources, advocating for change, supporting local businesses. It can create a more resilient and inclusive economy.
It reminds us that even in the face of huge economic challenges, we're not helpless. We can make choices, advocate for policies that promote fairness and sustainability, and work together to build a better future.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the UK economy, it's clear that there are no easy solutions. It's a web of interconnected problems, and every proposed solution comes with its own risks and benefits.
What stands out to you most from all this? What are the key takeaways for our listeners as they navigate these turbulent times?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the economy, it's not this abstract force outside of our control. It's a reflection of the choices we make, the policies we put in place, and the values we prioritize.
And those decisions, they have a ripple effect. They shape the future of the UK and the lives of everyone living here.
Absolutely. So as you go about your day, I encourage you to stay informed, think critically, participate in the conversation about the UK economy. Your voice matters, your choices matter. Together, we can build a more equitable and sustainable future.
That's a great point to end on. And while we've been focusing on the UK's domestic situation, we can't forget about the global context. You know, those figures on foreign aid we discussed earlier.
Right. It's a key part of the puzzle.
Yeah?
The UK's role in the world, its military commitments, its foreign aid contributions, they all have economic consequences.
One of the sources actually highlighted the UK's aid to Ukraine since the Russian invasion. Billions of pounds in military, humanitarian, and economic support. It shows just how interconnected we are globally. and how those connections impact the economy.
Exactly. Global events, they can shake up supply chains, disrupt energy markets, rattle investor confidence. All of that can ripple back and affect the UK.
It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? On one hand, you have this moral obligation to help those in need and uphold international commitments. But on the other hand, there are pressing domestic economic challenges, the needs of your own citizens.
Right. That's where the debate gets really interesting. Is there a point where the cost of foreign aid or military involvement outweighs the benefits? How do we balance those global responsibilities with our domestic priorities?
It's a complex question that requires careful thought and a deep understanding of everything involved. There are no easy answers. But by having these conversations and analyzing things critically, we can at least make more informed decisions about how the UK uses its resources and navigates its place in the world.
And these decisions aren't made in isolation. The global economic landscape is constantly in flux. It's affected by geopolitics, technology, even climate change.
It's a dynamic system. And the UK economy, like all economies, it's constantly adapting and responding to these external pressures.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. The UK autonomy, with all its complexities and issues, it's ultimately a reflection of us as a society.
It's a result of our values,
Yeah.
our priorities, and the choices we make both individually and as a nation.
By having thoughtful discussions, advocating for policies that match our values, and making informed decisions in our own lives, we can shape the economy and create a future that's fairer, more sustainable, and more prosperous for everyone.
That's a powerful thought to keep in mind. This isn't just about numbers and graphs. It's about people's lives, their hopes, their dreams. By understanding the forces at play, we can all contribute to a better economic future for the UK.
Absolutely. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for positive change.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the UK economy. Until next time.